Welcome to Nature Therapy Online. Hello friends, and welcome to episode 41 of season 1 of Nature Therapy Online. Now I'm outside in my garden and the sun is setting. It's a beautiful spring evening, and I want to have a quick word before I introduce an incredible interview I've done with the author Daniel Allison, the author and storyteller Daniel Allison, which is coming up shortly. I just wanted to quickly let you know that this is the penultimate episode of season 1 of the podcast. So, as you know, I will sometimes refer to this podcast as season 1, as we've been going through the episodes over the last 10 months. I don't always, often I will just say the episode number, but occasionally I will pop in and remind you that it's actually season 1. And the reason that I've done that is because I've had a sense that I will need to take a break at some point and have a little think about moving forward, give myself a rest from the podcast, and that time seems to be now. So I'm going to talk in the final episode of season 1 next week all about moving forward and how the podcast will change, and how I will spend the time during the break, which will be for a couple of months until the end of June 2021. Or if you're listening far into the future, then, you know, and you're listening back, then probably you will just be waiting, 30 seconds or so after the episode finishes, and you'll go straight to season 2. You know, most people listen to podcasts retrospectively. So yeah, wanted to let you know that, folks, before I go ahead with the rest of this episode. Now, this episode's coming up now is all about my interview with Daniel Allison. So without further ado, I will hand over to the interview. Hi there, folks, and welcome to another episode of Nature Therapy Online. So I've got a really special guest here with me today, and I'm really excited to have Daniel Allison here with me. So if you haven't heard of Daniel Allison yet or come across his work, he's a really well-respected storyteller. He's a storyteller's coach. He's the author of 3 amazing books called Scottish Myths and Legends, The Shattering Sea, and Finn and the Fianna. And Daniel also runs the Roundhouse, which is the world's first membership site for oral storytellers. I'm a member myself, and Daniel has also been coaching me in storytelling skills over the last year, which is how I come across Daniel. And his work is just amazing. And there's a deep respect for nature that runs throughout pretty much everything that he does. So I wanted to pick Daniel's brains and ask him questions about his relationship in his writing and his storytelling with nature. So hi, Daniel, and thank you for being here.
Hi, Steve. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. I'm really delighted that you're here. So for those who maybe haven't come across your work already, Daniel, could you tell us a little bit about your storytelling and your fiction, and perhaps where your focus is at the moment with your work?
Yeah, sure. Well, as you said, I'm primarily a writer and a storyteller, and now a writing coach and storytelling coach. And for the last couple of years, last few years actually, because I went away and lived in Thailand for the better part of a year before lockdown happened, I haven't been that focused on storytelling performance and been focused more on teaching and on my writing. Performance-wise, I focus on Celtic myths and legends, stories from British Isles, and also stories from animistic cultures, such as those of Siberia, the Australian Aboriginals, San Bushmen of South Africa, and others. And then in terms of my writing, I've got two main threads. One is my series Celtic Myths and Legends Retold, which the first book in that series was Scottish Myths and Legends, which came out about this time last year. The second book in the series was Finn and the Fianna, which just came out a couple of weeks ago. And well, I'm probably going to be at this for quite a number of years. What I'm doing with that series is trying to popularize the Celtic stories, the stories from the British Isles, Welsh stories, Scottish stories, Irish stories, by telling them in a new voice, in a way that is easy to read, so that anyone can pick up a book and enjoy it, which feels fresh, but which also captures the oral feel of the stories, and also as much as possible of the power and the depth and the beauty of those stories. Because I would love to get to a stage where, just as your average semi-literate person nowadays knows, can tell you who a few Greek gods are, will recognize the name of Zeus and Hera and Hercules, and will also know about the Norse gods, about Thor and Odin and Loki. I'd love for them to also know the Celtic stories, and to know who Cuchulainn is, and to know who Finn McCool is, to know who the Cailleach is. So that's one of my projects. I'm currently working on a retelling of the Mabinogion, the Welsh collection of legends. And then my other project is a series called the Orkney Cycle, which I know you're familiar with.
Yeah.
Which is a kind of redreaming, or dreaming into the gaps in Celtic mythology. Because as you all know, Celtic mythology, Scottish lore and legend is very sparse. We've only got like a few ragged threads here and there of what was once a great tapestry. So there are these huge gaps. We don't know the names of most of our gods. We've lost probably, the vast majority of our stories. And this is sort of a lot of sadness for many of us to this day. But it does offer an invitation for those of us who are interested in creative mythology. You could call it in dreaming into the gaps, writing into the gaps, exploring what else might have been there. So what I'm doing there is writing a series set in prehistoric Scotland, but also stretching out across Northern Europe, Scandinavia, Faroe, Iceland, mixing in existing prehistory, what we know from archaeological sites and the archaeological record, along with existing folklore and legends, and blending those together with elements of contemporary fantasy writing to create a kind of historical or prehistoric fantasy epic, which is in turn part of a kind of larger series of series, which I'll probably be writing for decades to come, which I call the Tears of the Stars. My first currently unpublished novel was part of that. That was a fantasy set in post-apocalyptic Scotland. And so I want to write lots of series set in our past, in our future, in the mythic past, all as a kind of creative mythology, a way for me to look more deeply into and experience more deeply our myths and legends and lore.
That's amazing, Daniel. And so much of what you were saying there just got my ecotherapy juices flowing, for want of a much better expression. But when you were talking about like Finn McCool and the Cailleach and the Mabinogion, and how you're trying to repopularize all of this, it just struck me like how important it is, and also like those deep links with nature. I mean, for people who aren't aware of any of these, just really powerful myths, nature is all over them. The creation myths, like the Mabinogion, for example. I only started reading that on the basis of your recommendation, and something that struck me is, all of this, just this fascinating lore. Everything is just outside, with the hills and animals, and there's just so much beauty and strangeness. And yet some of the materials that I come across seem to be really quite hard to read, because some of the texts are quite, well, the Mabinogion is one of the oldest scripts in the British Isles now, or were they the oldest, perhaps, fictional script? Is that right?
oldest prose literature in
That's
Britain, I
it.
guess.
That's the one. And yeah, and I think, for all like the beauty of having that captured, in ancient form, which is so fascinating in itself to read, it can, the way that I think we read and we've been, brought up in our modern culture to read, I think is very different. And I think when I read your Scottish Myths and Legends book, I think that's what I really appreciated, how reading how the way that you had retold the Scottish myths, compared to a lot of the older books that I've read, just felt a lot more genuinely engaging. And I think as such, it, going back to the ecotherapy side of things, I mean, again, like the Scottish myths and legends, I mean, I think all of those feel like nature myths to me. And I think when these stories are told in an engaging way, it opens our mind to nature in a different way, and it helps us to look at the landscape in a different way. So it feels like what you're doing is nature work in its own way. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts around that, about the links between the work that you're doing, with myths and legends, folk tales and old tales, and nature connection. What are your thoughts about that realm in general?
Yeah, well, I think telling the old stories, rewriting the old stories, for me is it's kind of like nature therapy for me, which perhaps then gets passed on to the listener or the reader. The stories which I tend to tell, to go back to the how I mentioned, I like to tell stories from animistic cultures, hunter-gatherer peoples like the Siberian tribes or the Bushmen.
Mm.
These are people, like the Bushmen are believed to have perhaps the oldest continuous culture in the entire world. So these are people whose entire worldview is an animistic one. It's a worldview in which everything is alive, every tree is alive, every rock is alive, every river is alive and has its own spirit and have their own way of speaking. And some people are able to learn to speak those languages or listen to those languages. And life is dictated by nature. Like the Bushmen believed or believe that if they came across an eland, an antelope out there in the bush and they're hunting, that be chosen to come to them and to allow itself hunted. So that a gift from nature, from the spirits, from the eland people. And if they weren't given that gift, if they decided not to present themselves, then the people would go hungry. So nature was master. And
Mm.
so there's this view in these animistic societies of the fundamental aliveness of all things in nature and of the fundamental connection between all things, that everything can become something else. That's, say, in the Siberian story of Nyan Ganes, a man is out hunting and he falls through a river and he comes to another land and he sees a woman riding by in a reindeer. So he goes over to her and touches her and she starts screaming. And he realizes eventually that he has a sickness spirit in this world and he has made her sick. He has become a sickness spirit. A girl is running away from the moon man who's chasing her. So she becomes the lamp to disguise herself. Everything is fundamentally connected to everything else. And so can become something else. A person can become an animal can become a person. And it seems, we don't know, but it seems that every prehistoric people in the world had this worldview. It was universal, despite there are always so many differences between people, this was a universal. And there are certain storytelling traditions that have really kept this in a really in a pretty pure, unaltered state. As time has gone on, stories, they change, they adapt to the time they find themselves in. So European stories have this, but sometimes it's like you have to kind of dig down for a bit.
Mm.
But the Bushmen stories, it's right there. The Siberian stories, it's right there. The Christian missionaries, didn't tend to get so far into Siberia because it's not a hugely hospitable place. So the stories weren't altered so much. And then the Scottish ones, like you say, they really have it too. Our stories, have been, a lot of them have been changed a lot over the years, but particularly if you look at the Hebridean stories, which are from, the Hebrides, the very edge of the Eurasian continent, the very edge of the world, in a sense, they have this same they have the same thing to them, don't they? In which everything can become something else, and the most wondrous of things are possible because the other world is ever present. So this is a very long answer.
It's a
I
really
think
good answer. Carry on, please.
I think that worldview is one that I think it's one that we fundamentally have in us. I think I had it intuitively as a child, but lost it being a Western person growing up in a Western society with a Western worldview. I began to regard myself as an atheist growing up. But then when I got older, when I was at university, I studied with a teacher called Brian Bates, an amazing author. He wrote books called The Way of Weird, The Wisdom of Weird, The Real Middle Earth, which is about shamanic consciousness in Britain. And so I learned from him about the shamanic worldview, about animistic worldviews, and this really hit home. And from there, I explored other spiritual systems, explored other places, and I think this animistic worldview, I sort of rediscovered it, and it felt like home. In particular, I came across some books, some children's books called the Chronicles of Ancient Darkness by Michelle Paver, a wonderful, wonderful series set in the Upper Paleolithic in northern Scandinavia, in which these tribal people live, completely in harmony with nature, and always talking to the forest, to the rivers, to the animals, the spirits, and everything in their life is controlled by the spirits in their worldview. And this just felt so right to me that I think I found that through this, when after discovering story and telling these stories, listening to these stories, reading these stories, was a way of reaffirming this worldview to myself, and reaffirming this worldview and the power of nature, and the ultimate source of beauty, of life, of love, and everything in life is from nature. So it's it's a kind of therapeutic thing for me to use these stories as a way of engaging with nature, and then hopefully to pass that on to people who listen.
That's great, Daniel. And that's so much of what you said there. Just, I mean, I could, to be honest, respond to each point in about, an hour for each point. So I'll try to keep myself as brief as possible. But something that just really struck me when you were talking, and I had this same feeling when I interviewed a guy called Alistair recently, who's an ecotherapist, and he was also talking about, he's Australian, and he was talking about ancient Aboriginal culture in Australia. And Alistair Taylor, his name is. Sorry, Alistair. Oh, you know him, do you?
Yeah.
Great. And well, I mean, you'll a lot of what he was saying, like really rang true with what you were saying, and my response then was as it is now, which is that it's so fascinating how or sad perhaps in a lot of ways, how ancient ways of being, like people acknowledging that life is dictated by nature, and nature is everything. We're a small part of it, and nature is master. And even even on a very practical level, the way these stories talk about how people can become animals and animals can become people. I mean, even in terms of we don't come from nowhere and go nowhere. Even on a very physical level, our bodies are recycled. Even if we're burnt and turned into dust, the dust can be sprinkled into the sea, but that goes somewhere, it becomes part of the whole again. And for me, these stories, this acknowledgement from ancient cultures is pointing to just the reality of things and the reality of the ecosystem. And it just seems to me that we've come so far in so-called modern living, and that we're starting to just realize now, like, oh, hang on, we need to wake up. And actually what we're waking up to is the fact that ancient cultures were right, and where we were as in Western Europe, thousands of years ago, in many ways, it was a lot wiser than where we are now. But as I say, I could talk about it for a long time, so I won't. But something I wanted to ask you, because you are clearly so passionate about all of this, and it strikes me, someone who's so connected with nature in such a way that you write about it, and you're so into it deeply in your work. You must have had a lot of powerful moments. And I know that you've also lived all kinds of places, as you were mentioning before, like and probably seen all kinds of incredible landscapes. So I wondered if you could perhaps share a powerful personal moment that you've had in nature, whether that's in Europe, here in Scotland, anywhere in the world, just something that stays with you that you could share with the listeners.
Yeah, certainly. Well, the moment that comes to mind, or I might go with two, a moment that comes to mind is from when I was in Kenya. I dreamed of going to Kenya all my childhood. The thing I wanted was to go to the Masai Mara and see the lions and giraffes and all the rest of it. That was what I wanted more than anything. So after I left school, I went on one of these programs where you go and volunteer to teach in a school. And after I'd done that for a few months, I went with a group of people on a little trip to the Masai Mara for 3 days. And there was a moment we were out in a little truck, you go in, open top truck, and we drove up to where some lionesses were lying around in the sunshine. And I was looking down at this lioness who was pretty close to the truck. And she was just lying there having a nice afternoon relax, as my cat is doing on the desk right now. And she just looked, opened her eyes for a moment and looked into my eyes. And I had knowledge in that moment of what it is to be prey. I was not a person to her. I wasn't Daniel. I wasn't someone whose feelings were to be considered. I was a piece of meat. And if I wasn't, up in that truck thing, if she was hungry and I was on the grass, she would, eat me without a moment's thought. And there was something really, really powerful in that for me. It was like a whole aspect of nature, the predatory side of nature, the side of nature that's unforgiving, that doesn't care about you at all, because there is, that is a huge part of nature. Like I heard someone put it beautifully the other day, that it was David Abrams, wonderful writer, wrote The Spell of the Sensuous, and he was saying, nature is very beautiful, but she's not pretty. She's not pretty. And that, I think that made me think of this moment too. There's something beautiful but not pretty in the look that lioness had in her eyes. So that's always stayed with me.
And I love that, because so often I think when we try to recall powerful moments in nature, very often it's the beautiful moments that spring to mind for a lot of people. I know they do for myself, and there's something just very humbling about that. And it sounds like it got you thinking of, not even thinking consciously, but just this very physical sense of being a part of the whole, something quite scary. All of a sudden, as you say, you're not you're not this this self that you think you are in that moment. You're a part of the whole, and you're food, and we are food to a lot of creatures. And I think the power of that for me is I don't know if that's the same for you, but the British Isles are so tame. I mean, we've killed off all the predators here, and we don't come across those big predators in, or any big predators in the UK anymore. There's very few things here that could kill us, and if they did, it would probably be by accident, or it would be a Rottweiler dog. So thanks for sharing that. It's just super powerful, and I think a really important reminder to for us in these very tamed isles we live on, that nature is more than just the pretty flowers blooming. Its beauty is sometimes in its in its fierceness. So cheers for that, Daniel. That's something that will stay with my mind for the rest of the day, I think, those eyes. And something that I was wondering about, and you can say no to this if you want to. I was wondering if you had any inspiring nature-based stories in your mind, or one in particular that you just really love and you think that listeners could get a lot out of engaging with and meeting, for the first time if they haven't already. And if there is any, nature-based story that springs to your mind that you'd like to share, if you could share it with us, not, whether just a snippet of a telling or even if you could tell us about it. I mean, is there anything that springs to mind when I say that, Daniel?
Yeah. There is a story that springs to mind is the most beautiful song in the forest, which is a
Mm,
pygmy story. Although now
mm.
you've got me thinking about lionesses, and I'm thinking about the hunter's tears,
Uh,
which is a very powerful story. So yeah, I'll leave it up to you. Would you rather hear the most beautiful song in the forest or the hunter's tears?
I think the most beautiful song in the forest, despite the fact I've just talked about all that fierceness, I've just gone back to my pure Britishness. I'm like, so tell me the beautiful one. How about that? Can we have that one?
All right. Well, yeah. It's a pretty short story. It's one that Joseph Campbell, the great mythologist, author of Hero with a Thousand Faces, used to tell. So I heard him telling it on an audiobook. It's a pygmy story from the Congo, and it goes that within the Congo, somewhere deep within that vast forest, there was once a village, and this village there was houses here and there and there, and in one particular house, one particular little hut, there lived a family, and there was the mother and the father and three sons, and two of the sons were good, strong, hard-working lads, and the father was proud of them because they always wanted to hunt. They wanted to be like their father. They wanted to be like the older boys and do the things their older boys did. But the youngest son, he was different. He didn't like to work. He didn't like to hunt. He just liked to wander in the forest and get lost in staring into a waterfall, staring at the flower getting absorbed in its colors, staring up and watching the leaves as they rustled in the gentle wind. And the rest of the family didn't really have any time for this, particularly not the father. One day, the youngest son was off walking through the forest when he heard a song, a bird song. And it was the most beautiful song he had ever heard. It was sweeter than honey. It was more nourishing than water, than food. It was more than everything he had ever heard. It was more than everything he'd ever dreamed. It was like everything he'd looked for in the village, everything he'd looked for in the forest, everything that he could look for in life. It was in that song. And so off he went towards it. And he pictured a beautiful bird of paradise, feathers of every color. And he came closer and closer. And there it was. And it was a tiny little brown bird, the most plain, ordinary bird you could imagine. That was it. And it finished its song. And he looked up at it and he spoke to it. And he said, "Your song is so beautiful. I would love it if you could come and sing for my family. Would you please come home with me?" And because he spoke from his heart, the bird flew down and landed on his shoulder. So home they went. And they got to the village. It was evening, the cooking fires had been lit, the sun was setting, and he went into his hut. And his brothers and his mother and father were there. And his father was in a good mood because the hunt had gone well that day. And he came in with the birds and he said, everyone, listen to this. And they're, what is it? And they saw a little bird, and the bird opened its mouth and it began to sing. And it sang that beautiful song, and everyone was completely entranced. And then it finished. And the brothers just stared at the bird, and the mother just stared at the bird, and she put her hand in her heart, obviously moved. And the father, wow, a silly little thing, that silly little bird. What kind of child are you? What kind of young man are you, bringing home a little bird when you should be learning to hunt? And the bird flew away. The boy was sad, of course. So the next day he went out looking for it, and he searched the forest until he heard it singing, and he found it, and again when it finished its song, he spoke to it and he said, I'm sorry my father spoke that way. He doesn't understand, but I think it would be good for him to listen to you. I think he just needs to hear a bit more of your song. Would you please come back and sing for us again? And because he spoke from his heart, the bird flew down, landed on his shoulder. So they returned to the village. The cook fires had been lit, the sun was setting, smoke rising from the huts, and in they went to the hut. And the boy's father was not in a good mood today. The hunt had gone badly. There wasn't much meat. And he saw the bird. And before the bird could sing, he said, You and that bird, get that stupid little bird out of here. And the bird flew away. The next day, the boy thought about whether or not he should search for the bird again. It was scary, that moment, the previous night with his father. But he was so sure that his father, that everyone in the village, that he himself needed that bird and its song, that he went out looking for it again. He searched the forest. He went there and here and here and there until he heard its song in the distance. And he found it, spoke to it, and asked it again, Please, can we try just one more time? Could you come back with me and sing for my family? And because he spoke from his heart, the bird flew down onto his shoulder. They made their way back to the village. Cook fires had been lit. The sun was setting, and there was a strange feeling about the village. There was no sound of laughter coming from any of the huts. And into the hut they went. There was the mother, head down, cooking. Brothers, heads down. And there was the boy's father, with a fierce look in his eyes. The hunt had not gone well that day either. And in fact, it had not gone well that day because he had made a mistake. He had made a noise and he had scared their prey off. And so all the men were angry at him. Everyone in the village was ashamed of him. People were going to go hungry that night because of him. His mood was foul. And when he saw his youngest son enter with that bird, he didn't shout. He just reached over, snatched the bird from the boy's shoulder and threw it against the wall. He threw it against the wall and hit the wall. Down it fell to the ground, and it was still. It was dead. And the boy fell to his knees, held the little bird up, and he was crying, saying, No, 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 my bird. And then his father, began to shake, and his breath wouldn't come, and his family crowded round him. He fell to the ground, and he writhed there, and then he fell still, his eyes open, his mouth wide. He was dead. And the people in that village grieved greatly for the man who died, for his family who would be without a husband, a father. And they spoke of what had happened. And they argued over what had happened. And some people said that the man had died because he needed that song. He needed that song more than anyone else. And because that song wasn't just in the bird, the song was in him. The song was his own. And that's the story of the most beautiful song in the forest.
Oh, thank you so much, Daniel. That was just really beautiful. Such a beautiful telling. I feel like I want to just go and sit and ponder on that for a really long time, but I'm not going to respond with words. I'm sure that the listeners feel the same way that I do. So I just want to thank you for sharing that just beautiful story. And I guess, moving on, I was wondering, now people have heard, you telling in that really inimitable and just beautiful way that you do tell. If you could share where listeners can find you online and find out more about your 100 projects that it seems you're into at the moment.
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much. I'm really glad you enjoyed it. It's been a really long time since I've told it, I think. So it's just slightly rusty, but yeah, such a beautiful one. It's one of yeah, I'll never forget and never stop telling, I'm sure. So yeah, where people can find me. Well, there is my podcast, probably is a good starting off place. So that is House of Legends. I release 2 episodes every month, one with a story from me, one with a story from a guest teller, and I get the most wonderful storytellers in the whole world. So I'd highly recommend checking that out. I also have my books. So there's Scottish Myths and Legends, there's Finn and the Fianna, and there is The Shattering Sea, the first part of the Orkney cycle, which I talked about. And there's also Silverborn. Silverborn is a short ebook, it's a short collection of stories in which characters from the Shattering Sea are gathered around the fire in ancient Orkney telling stories. And it's a kind of creative blending of stories which I know and tell from the north of Scotland, mixed with created stories which tie into the whole Orkney cycle and mythos. And that's free for everyone who joins my mailing list. So people can just go to my website, houseoflegends.me, and you can order your copy of Silverborn and you'll get it sent to you as an ebook to read on your iPad or your phone or Kindle or whatever you have. Also, if people are interested in storytelling themselves, I have the Roundhouse, which is a membership site for storytellers. So it's a membership site stroke online school. You get a couple of new study modules every month when you sign up. You have a community to join. We have regular webinars with guest teachers. We have story shares. It's everything you could possibly need to develop as an oral storyteller besides actually doing practice. And there's lots to help you make sure you do that as well. And then also I offer coaching in groups. There's going to be a new year one group starting soon. I also do one-to-one coaching for anyone anywhere in the world because it's all online. And then I also offer book coaching for anyone who's writing a book right from the start. Excuse me. Right from coming up with your idea to publishing, self-publishing, if that's what you're going to do. So those are my various offerings. I've probably forgotten one or two because I try and do a bit too much, but those are the main ones, I think.
Amazing, Daniel. And just to say to the listeners, I will post links to all of Daniel's work and his main websites on the main blog on naturetherapyonline.net. And yeah, and I told them that you're doing 100 amazing things, and you really are, and I'm sure there are more as well that you've forgotten. But I just want to say, Daniel, thank you so much for giving me your time, because I can vouch for the listeners that Daniel is an extremely busy human being, and you've just moved to the beautiful countryside as well. So he's moving house on top of everything else. So I'm really appreciating the fact that you've given me your time and to talk about your work, and again just for sharing that gorgeous story at the end, which I feel like I'm gonna have to learn and tell myself at some point, although I'm not gonna ever tell it as good as that, so I don't know so I don't know if I should try, but thanks so much again, Daniel. And is there anything else you want to say just before we round up?
Just to say thank you for having me on the podcast. I really enjoyed listening to you mentioned Alistair Taylor earlier. I really enjoyed listening to that interview with you and Alistair. It was really, really enjoyable conversation. And it's been a pleasure working with you. I've really enjoyed seeing you develop as a storyteller and seeing all the energy and all the gifts which you bring to the world and to your work. So all the best for the future.
Oh, shucks. Thank you so much. And I didn't even pay him to say that, folks, would you believe? So thank you. Thanks a lot, Daniel. And you take care and have a lovely day, whatever you're doing, and just keep on with the fantastic work. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
visit me online at naturetherapyonline.net.